Today you will know the dark story of Adolf Eichmann, a cold and calculating man who was behind the Nazi death machine. Brace yourself, because this story is not just about one man, but about the horror he helped create. On April 11, 1961 in Jerusalem, the deathly silence of the People's House would be shattered by screams of horror. A 55-year-old man walked calmly toward a bulletproof glass cage, while hundreds of eyes watched him with pure hatred. Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the transportation of millions of Jews straight to the gas chambers, would finally face his surviving victims. For 16 years, he lived in hiding in Argentina under a false identity. For 16 years, families destroyed by the Holocaust waited for justice. Now the accountant of death stood there, just meters from people whose parents, children, and siblings he had sent to die. Could you look into the eyes of the man who planned your family's death? Stay until the end to discover Eichmann's chilling last words before his execution. Subscribe now, like, and be part of this story, Eichmann's escape. In May 1960 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on a cold late afternoon, a man steps off a bus on Garibaldi Street, a discreet neighborhood on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. His steps are calm, almost routine. He wears thick glasses, carries a weathered leather briefcase, and wears a suit jacket that has seen better days. His name is Ricardo Clement, and he works as a department head at the Mercedes-Benz factory. His neighbors see him as reserved, punctual, and without much vanity, an ordinary German immigrant. But all this is a lie. Ricardo Clement is the cover for one of the most wanted war criminals on the planet, Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the final solution, the systematic plan that exterminated millions of Jews during the Holocaust. How did this man, a key cog in the Nazi machine, manage to hide so far from Europe in ruins after the war? To understand, we must return to the turbulent year of 1945, when the Third Reich was falling, but its ghosts still haunted the survivors. With Germany in ruins and the Reich collapsing, many Nazi officials fled desperately to avoid the war tribunals. Eichmann was among them. He knew that if captured, he would likely be hanged like the others tried at Nuremberg. His salvation would come through the so-called rat lines, clandestine networks organized to smuggle former Nazis out of Europe under false identities. These escape routes were not mere rumors. They were real. Some were improvised by former SS members. Others, however, relied on the help of respected and powerful institutions, such as the Catholic Church and even the International Committee of the Red Cross. As difficult as it may be to imagine, these entities played a crucial role in the escape of war criminals. The most effective of these routes was the so-called Vatican route. From within the Vatican walls, Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, known for his Nazi sympathies, offered spiritual and logistical assistance. Hudal used his position to issue letters of recommendation, arrange stays in monasteries, and above all, facilitate the obtaining of false identity documents bearing the Red Cross seal. It was through this route that, in 1950, Adolf Eichmann obtained a safe conduct issued in Genoa, Italy. Armed with a new identity, Ricardo Clement, and legitimate documents, he embarked for the South American continent. The chosen destination was no accident. Why Argentina? During the final years of the war and even afterward, Juan Domingo Perón's regime had shown itself sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Documents revealed decades later, and investigations conducted by journalists such as Uki Gonyi, show that a silent agreement existed between members of the SS and sectors of the Argentine Secret Service. Argentina offered refuge, anonymity, and new life opportunities in exchange for technology, influence, and money. Among the thousands of fugitives who arrived in Buenos Aires after the war were doctors, engineers, intelligence officers, and even murderers. Eichmann blended into this crowd. For the next few years, he lived a low-key life. He worked as a laborer, then was promoted. He rented a modest house on Garibaldi Street. In 1952, he brought his wife and children from Austria, completing the disguise of an ordinary immigrant family. He never spoke of his past, never dared to attract attention. However, he was not a free man. He was a fugitive. For almost a decade, the world forgot Adolf Eichmann, but chance did not. It all began with a romance. His eldest son, Klaus Eichmann, kept the family's original surname. Young, impulsive, and not very discreet, he met and began dating Sylvia Hermann, an Argentine teenager, daughter of Lothar Hermann, a blind man who had survived the Dachau concentration camp. When Sylvia mentioned that Klaus's father was German and that his last name was Eichmann, something clicked in Lothar's mind. He knew that name. It wasn't just any name. It was the name of the man who had organized the mass deportations, who had signed extermination orders, who had been reported missing. Lothar Hermann was immediately suspicious. From then on, he began gathering evidence, and those suspicions led to the right man, Fritz Bauer, the courageous chief prosecutor of the West German state of Hesse, a Jewish survivor who dedicated his life to hunting down fugitive Nazis. Bauer knew that if he trusted his own government colleagues, many of whom had served under the Nazi regime, Eichmann would escape again. He took a radical decision. He contacted the Israeli government. Israeli authorities, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, evaluated the complaint but soon encountered an obstacle. Extradition was impossible. Argentina did not recognize war crimes as a legal justification. The failure to capture Joseph Mengele, the terror doctor of Auschwitz, was still fresh in their minds. The solution? A secret operation. The Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, formed a special unit of 11 agents. The mission: confirm Eichmann's identity and bring him alive to stand trial in Jerusalem. It was an operation without guarantees, dangerous, illegal under international law, but morally urgent for a people still bearing the scars of the Holocaust. Agent Zvi Aharoni, whose family had been exterminated by the Nazis, was the first to take action. He traveled alone to Buenos Aires, watched Eichmann for days, compared photographs, and studied his habits. After weeks of observation, there was no longer any doubt. The man on Garibaldi Street was indeed Adolf Eichmann. On May 11, 1960, it was already dusk when Eichmann got off the bus. He walked distractedly as always. A few meters from his house, 3 agents surrounded him. The attack was swift, silent, and calculated. Eichmann tried to scream, but was subdued within seconds. He immediately admitted who he was, one of the agents recalled. There was no resistance. It was as if he had expected it. For the next 10 days, the agents kept him hidden in a safe house while they waited for an El Al flight, the Israeli airline, to participate in a diplomatic mission. To board him without arousing suspicion, they drugged him and disguised him as a sick diplomat. It was May 23, 1960. Before Parliament, the world heard David Ben-Gurion's declaration, "Adolf Eichmann is on Israeli territory." The revelation fell like a bombshell. For some, it was a triumph of justice. For others, it was an international scandal. Debates about sovereignty, international law, and memory began to dominate the newspapers. But for the survivors, there was no doubt. For the first time, the executioner would come face to face with his victims, not on the battlefield, but before the tribunal of history. And while the world reacted, Eichmann silently awaited what would come next. But what happens when one of the greatest perpetrators of the Holocaust is finally put on trial? The trial. To understand the trial, one must first understand the man in the dock. Adolf Eichmann was not born a monster, nor did he seem destined for cruelty from childhood. He was, as he himself liked to say, just an ordinary man, a dull, practical man, never present on the front lines of war or at the top of the Nazi hierarchy. Yet it was precisely this apparent banality that made him so lethal. The son of a Protestant company manager, Eichmann grew up in Linz, Austria, the same city where Hitler spent part of his youth. Even as a young man, he displayed little intellectual brilliance. He failed a grade, dropped out of school, and failed in almost every career he attempted. He sold oil and worked as a clerk, but never distinguished himself. He was, above all, a man without direction. And perhaps it was precisely this lack of direction that made him vulnerable to the power of totalitarian ideologies. In 1932, at the age of 26, Eichmann joined the Austrian National Socialist Party, drawn more by a sense of belonging than by deep-seated ideological convictions. It was a time of crisis, uncertainty, and national humiliation. The following year, after Hitler's rise to power in Germany, Eichmann found his definitive path. He joined the SS, the feared Schutzstaffel, and there discovered his calling in the bureaucratic machine of terror. He was assigned to the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Department. At first, his mission was simply to expel Jews from German territory. This was the embryonic stage of state anti-Semitism. He devised deportation plans to Madagascar, Palestine, and anywhere outside the Reich. The goal was, of course, to empty Europe of Jews. It was still a brutal but not genocidal expulsion policy. But as the war intensified and the Nazi occupation expanded, the logistical deportation plans became impractical. Europe was in flames, borders were closing, ships had nowhere to go, and ghettos were beginning to overflow with bodies and hunger. So the plan changed. In January 1942, in a lakeside mansion on the outskirts of Berlin, the Wannsee Conference was convened. There, 15 men, jurists, military officers, bureaucrats, and representatives of the Nazi elite, met to formalize the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. Systematic extermination was decided upon in a quick, objective, and emotionless meeting. There were no votes or heated debates, just agreements among calm-spoken men with polite gestures. In the end, Eichmann not only recorded every word, but also left the room with the responsibility of putting the plan into action. It would be up to him to coordinate the trains, thousands of trains, that would transport millions of men, women, and children to the death camps. He was the logistical architect of the genocide. Fast forward to Jerusalem again, in April 1961. 19 years after that decisive meeting at Wannsee, Adolf Eichmann sat inside a bulletproof glass booth, in the center of a courtroom set up in the People's House Theater. That structure, erected with extreme discipline and vigilance, resembled a theatrical performance, but nothing about it was staged. "I saw before me someone so ordinary, so banal," recalled Jeff Kahn, a young American who managed to get a ticket to one of the sessions. The contrast was disturbing. Instead of the figure of a monster, the audience saw only a man who resembled an office worker, and it was precisely this normality that was most frightening. The organizer of the deaths of millions did not have the face of a villain. He wore a gray suit, stood rigidly, and spoke in brief sentences. A technocrat, an administrator of barbarity. Why did Israel want to try Eichmann? Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion didn't just want justice. He wanted remembrance, he wanted education. He wanted to confront the collective trauma of the Jews, not just as victims of the Shoah, but as survivors with a voice. In Nuremberg, the victors had judged the vanquished. In Jerusalem, the persecuted people judged their tormentor. The Eichmann trial would be, in the words of prosecutor Gideon Hausner, the trial of the 20th century. And he had a clear plan: to give faces, names, and voices to the victims. It wouldn't just be a parade of documents, it would be a public act of remembrance and dignity. The turning point was allowing everything to be filmed. Milton Fruman, an American producer, came up with the idea, and after heated debates, Ben-Gurion relented. Discreet cameras were installed. The whole world watched. For the first time, the Holocaust was no longer just a stain on the history books. It became images, sounds, and emotions available to the public. It was a new kind of justice broadcast live, and it was also the first time Holocaust survivors testified publicly. Michael Podchlebnik took the stand and recounted how he cleaned corpses from gas vans. Yehuda Bacon spoke of his father's ashes in Auschwitz. Abba Kovner recounted his armed resistance in the dark streets of the Vilnius ghetto. Others described the long marches, the crowded trains, the constant smell of burning flesh, the hunger, the cold, the loss. Cameras captured everything and broadcast it to a planet that, until then, had never heard horror so raw. For Israeli society, it was transformative. Many could not understand how the Jews of Europe had been massacred with so little resistance. The trial exposed the painful truth. There was no passivity. There was desperation, fear, attempts to escape, and even heroism. But faced with the death machine created by men like Eichmann, few chances remained. And then came the defense. And with it, the abyss. Befehle sind Befehle. Orders are orders. That was Eichmann's line of defense. A functionary, he said, a logistics technician. He never killed anyone with his own hands, never pulled the trigger. He simply coordinated the trains. He claimed he had no choice. But there were gaps in that version, and the prosecution knew how to exploit them. Evidence emerged, papers bearing his signature, meeting records, deportation orders, and then the bombshell, Willem Sassen's recordings. Sassen was a former SS officer, a refugee in Argentina, who had convinced Eichmann to record his memoirs. On the tapes, Eichmann not only admitted his direct participation, he was proud of it. He expressed disappointment at not having been able to complete the work. He called himself an idealist, not a bureaucrat. He assumed his part in the slaughter with coldness and vanity, but there was something darker still. Budapest, 1944. When Himmler gave the order to halt the deportations to Auschwitz, Eichmann simply ignored it. He continued to personally supervise the trains carrying Hungarian Jews to their deaths. One of his subordinates even described his obsession as almost demonic. Eichmann wasn't content to simply obey. He wanted to see the genocide accomplished. And then came the children. In Paris in 1942, Eichmann ordered the deportation of hundreds of Jewish children. None survived. During the trial, a former SS officer revealed something even more cruel. Eichmann justified the children's deaths with cold logic. We must not leave alive those who might become future avengers. There, before everyone, Eichmann was exposed not as a cog, but as a mastermind. Not as a passive executor, but as the active author of the death machine. The trial, more than a legal act, was a dissection of the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a monster outside of reality. He was frightening precisely because he was all too real. A man without charisma, without visible hatred, but with a blind devotion to a murderous system. In the end, it wasn't his cruelty that shocked the world. It was his coldness. It was the fact that he could have been anyone. But the trial wasn't over yet. The sentence was approaching. The world watched. The witnesses spoke. The evidence was on the table. And now only one question remained. What would be Adolf Eichmann's fate? The theater that had once hosted plays and concerts was now the stage for the most solemn of human decisions. The curtains were open, but there was no performance, no characters. There was story, there was judgment. The silence in Jerusalem seemed to hold the breath of an entire world. Millions watched on the radio and through the discreet lenses installed in the courtroom walls as justice delivered its verdict. The judge read in a firm but measured voice, guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, guilty of crimes against humanity, guilty of war crimes. Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the path of death with administrative precision, had been sentenced to the maximum penalty, hanging. The trial had lasted 8 months. An entire court arose to judge the man who in the past had seemed invisible. There were 121 sessions, 1,500 documents examined, 112 witnesses heard, each testimony like a knife that tore through the veil of oblivion. The voices of the victims, muffled for decades, emerged not as laments, but as denunciations. And, in the end, there was no doubt. Eichmann was not a distracted official, nor a machine spinning without knowing where it led. He was a willing executioner, a man who planned, refined, insisted, who ignored orders to cease, who complained about the unfinished business. Even so, he appealed. On March 28, 1962, the Israeli Supreme Court upheld the sentence. With legal avenues exhausted, all that remained was a request for clemency to President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. Eichmann wrote in a measured, almost formal style. He claimed remorse. He said he had been merely an obedient cog in a larger machine, but it was too late. There would be no mercy. The president refused, and with him he rejected the idea that neutrality could be a shield from horror. May 31, 1962, Ramla Prison. As night enveloped Israel, a dense silence hung over the prison. Eichmann wrote his last words. He asked for wine, refused a rabbi, declared himself prepared. He remained arrogant, perhaps not out of bravery, but out of blind fidelity to the myth he had constructed for himself. At 11:58 p.m., he was led to the execution room. There were the officers, there were the doctors, there was the story. Eichmann ascended the scaffold without visible hesitation. His last words, recorded by those present, were a grotesque echo of the nationalism that had guided him. Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. These are the countries with which I most identified. I had to obey the rules of war and my flag. I am ready. At 12:01 a.m., on June 1st, the gallows fulfilled its function. No clamor, no crowd, just the silent conclusion of a process that sought not revenge but memory, justice, and truth. Eichmann became the only man to be legally executed by the State of Israel. A decision not made lightly, but with conviction. It was not the fate reserved for a soldier. It was the end of an architect of death, one who orchestrated the disappearance of millions with bureaucratic coldness and personal zeal. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea outside Israeli territorial waters. A symbolic, definitive gesture. Not even his memory deserved rest in the land of the victims. Eichmann's trial was not merely the end of a historical cycle. It was a watershed moment, a redefinition of the course of international justice, a milestone in humanity's moral conscience. In Nuremberg, the Allies had judged the Nazi leaders, but the structure was still external. The survivors watched. In Jerusalem, the survivors spoke, took the pulpit, named the dead, described the unspeakable. It was the trial where collective trauma left private diaries and became a public document, where memory became proof, where silence was overcome. For the first time, the survivors ceased to be mere numbers or anonymous figures. They became protagonists of historical truth. The tears shed in the courtroom were not just an expression of pain. They were an act of resistance. Every word, every memory rescued the dead from oblivion. Israel tried a man for crimes committed elsewhere in the world, against people of various nationalities. It was a legal landmark. Certain crimes are so profound that they don't belong solely to one nation. They undermine the very idea of humanity. Broadcast on television to dozens of countries, the trial entered homes, schools, and hearts. It became part of global culture. For the first time, the Holocaust was seen and heard, not as a historical fact, but as an experience, as a living scar. Adolf Eichmann, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, would later summarize, "We show this so that people know pure evil, so that they understand that it is possible to triumph over it without losing humanity." Israel didn't call the defendant Adolf Eichmann simply Eichmann, a deliberate gesture. Removing his proper name was to deny him a human identity. He was no longer an individual. Eichmann was more than a criminal. He was a warning. The true terror lay not in his actions, but in who he was. This wasn't a crazed tyrant or a man with bloodshot eyes. This was someone seemingly ordinary, who sat upright, spoke politely, presented statistics, and obeyed orders. Someone who hid behind rules and protocols, who saw trains, not the bodies they transported. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, captured what made the case so disturbing: the banality of evil. Eichmann wasn't an evil genius. He was quite the opposite, a routine but deadly obedient bureaucrat. He showed how evil can flourish not because of monsters, but because people stop thinking. The trial acted like a mirror, forcing us to look not only at Eichmann, but also at ourselves, our institutions, our choices, and our vigilance. It showed the worst that humanity can commit, but also revealed the best, the courage to seek justice, however belated. And he left us with a question that still resonates. In the face of cruelty, will we choose silence or truth? The answer lies not in books, but in the decisions of each generation. Eichmann was hanged in 1962, but the evil he represented has not died. He reinvents himself under new names, banners, and discourses. He hides in ideologies, systems, and routines. Sometimes he presents himself with a jacket and badge, other times with polite words and folders full of numbers. History has shown the way. It is up to us to keep our eyes open and prevent such horrors from happening again. So, what did you think of today's video? Did you know the story and the outcome of Adolf Eichmann? Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your presence is very important. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue unraveling history's darkest mysteries. See you in the next video.